So, a very warm welcome to everyone this evening. My name's Dorothy Miell. I'm the Head of College for Arts, Humanities and Social Sciences, and I'm going to be introducing the lecture this evening. And then the School of Divinity's Head of School, Helen Bond, is going to be wrapping up the evening and giving the vote of thanks and introducing the reception, which will happen afterwards. I really love inaugural lectures. I think it's an opportunity to bring together a really wide range of people to come together as an audience to hear about a colleague's area of work, presented, and this is a warning to you, Mark, in a very accessible format, but also to congratulate them on their chair and support them as their work continues to develop here. And I'd like to extend a particularly warm welcome to Mark's family, who, two of them at least, have very close links themselves to the university. So Harriet, the university chaplain, Ben, who's a first-year student here, and I hope enjoying the place, Isaac, Ruben and Susanna, a very warm welcome to all of you. So tonight's not going to be any exception to the pleasure of an inaugural. Indeed, I can't help thinking that the span of Mark's interests and achievement is such that we've probably got an even wider range of people in the audience tonight than we often have. So whilst we have friends and family and ex-students and members of the public, we're probably encompassing colleagues and current students not only from the School of Divinity, where he's based, but also from the worlds of philosophy and of physics. Mark is a very rare bird. Not only is he a hugely impressive scholar and teacher within his own specialist area, but he's someone who's made a really significant contribution to more than one area. His work began with a first degree in natural science and a PhD in condensed matter physics from the University of Cambridge, and he was a real pioneer in the area of physics of magnetism and a discoverer with Professor Steve Bramwell of UCL of spinner ice. And I'm not going to try and explain what that is, because I have no idea. I did read the page about it, but I'm still not sure that I fully understand it. But this has remained a very fertile area of research and interest since their discovery in 1997. As Mark puts it himself, having made that discovery, he then went on to discover theology and took a degree in theology and completed his ministerial training in Oxford, before serving as a curate in Cowley and subsequently becoming college chaplain at Oriel College in Oxford. He came to Edinburgh first in 2010, first as the Vice Provost at St Mary's Cathedral, and then he was appointed to the university in 2012 as a lecturer in science and religion in New College. His areas of interest are now on the relationship between the physical sciences and theology and the impact of science on modern views of the Bible, especially in thinking on miracles and divine action. Having been awarded the Boyle Medal for his work in science and theology last year, he delivered the associated Boyle Lecture on this topic in 2018 and is currently working on a new monograph as the second in a series of 3 books on related topics. His research has not only been successful in terms of critically acclaimed publications and prizes, but also through the series of projects that he's secured external funding for and his extensive knowledge exchange and public engagement work. He's regularly sought after as a keynote speaker and media commentator and plays important roles in a number of international societies and journal editorial boards. While Mark's been at New College, he's developed a hugely popular and impactful master's programme in science and religion, which attracts outstanding students whose work's been recognised at international level and is lauded as leading the programme, which is best of its kind in the world. He's also been core to the development of enormously successful MOOCs and an online Masters in Philosophy, Science and Religion with Professor Duncan Pritchard in philosophy. And more than 30,000 people around the world have studied on these courses. I hope this has given a bit of a flavour of Mark's career. He's something of a polymath, and it's difficult to do his work justice in these few minutes that I have. But we're delighted that he's achieved so much of his work here with us in Edinburgh, and are looking forward to his career continuing to flourish and develop here. So without further ado, can you join me in welcoming Professor Harris to the lectern to present his inaugural lecture.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, and thank you all for your support for coming out on this rather dreich December evening. It's great to see you. And I hope to give you a taste of something new I'm working on, really to do with the sort of history of 19th and early 20th century scientific thought in New College. So these are really my first thoughts towards a future book project, charting the history of natural science and theology as an academic subject here in Edinburgh, particularly New College. It goes back a surprisingly long way, because not only was the interaction between science and theology an important area of concern when New College was founded in the 1840s, but its chair in natural science was probably the world's first academic post created to address the science and religion debate directly, the very first. Well, there have been many such posts since then, but New College lays reasonable claim to being way ahead of everyone else. And some of the holders of that chair have held very distinctive views, which I think gain fresh relevance today. So I'll try to give you a 45-minute overview of these people. My title, Natural Selection at New College. Well, quite obviously there's a joke here, because there are two ways you can read it. So first, I will spend most of my time charting the ways in which evolutionary science has been received at New College down the ages, especially by those who held the chair in natural science. But second, that chair is no longer. It didn't adapt with the times. It's extinct, as the New College history makes clear with this delightful plate headed Professors of Chairs Now Extinct. So these three fine fellows, John Fleming, John Duns and James Young Simpson, they were the three holders of the chair in natural science, and each of them had strong views on evolution, which dominated their writing and their teaching while they were in post. Not the kind of views you might expect, though. The noisy creation-evolution debate that we know today is actually a relatively recent innovation, stemming largely from the 1920s and onwards, and I expect that it would have amazed the three holders of the chair. They all had sound scientific pedigrees. They would have been amazed to see the debate presented as a stark choice between either the Bible or science. The issues were more subtle for them, and significantly, each of them develops their own position on evolution at key stages in the historical development of evolution as a scientific idea. And in fact, their thinking illustrates the ways that scientists were receiving these new developments as much as were theologians. For that matter, each of them also represents a different approach to the wider science and religion debate as well. And if it's true to say that the history of science and religion is most clearly captured by looking at the reception of evolution, then these three figures provide us with much of that history in miniature, with the advantage that the contextual factors that complicate any intellectual history, such as society, politics, religion, geography, and so on, they're all largely fixed in the case of these three by the fact that they all lived and worked in the same place and answered to the same institution. What was that institution? Well, at this point, I should show you my slightly complicated timeline. Please don't be afraid as I show you all those words on the screen. I will go through them, hopefully, and explain. This also serves as a summary of the lecture. The story starts with the disruption of 1843, when the Evangelical Party of the Church of Scotland broke away to form the Free Church. Said to be the most significant event in 19th century Scottish history, the disruption split society at every level, not unlike that achieved by the Brexit referendum in today's secular Britain. Of course, the Free Church needed to train ministers, and this is why New College was built in Edinburgh in 1846, and other free colleges in Aberdeen and Glasgow later. And of course, you only need to look at the architecture of New College and its place on the mound to guess that it was effectively a symbol in stone of the Free Church's defiance against the establishment. Thomas Chalmers, who was one of the most influential figures in the disruption and also the first principal of New College, he originally hoped there might be a whole Free Church university on this site. Well, that dream wasn't realised, but there was a firm conviction that New College students should receive a broad education. So, chairs in logic and moral philosophy were established, for instance, and distinctively, a chair in natural science. And all of this before the college had even been built. And here we come to the figure of John Fleming, who was the first holder of the chair, and he operated during the controversy surrounding the early evolutionary book, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, published in 1844. Fleming didn't live to see Darwin's Origin of Species in 1859, which is probably just as well when you think about the vitriol he levelled against Vestiges. I don't imagine his blood pressure would have been too good, but his successor, John Duns, did play a full part in the Origin of Species debate, as did one of the better-known principals of New College, Robert Rainey. Now, by the time we come to the third holder of the chair, James Young Simpson, the science has diversified massively beyond Darwin, and this is a phase that's sometimes referred to as the eclipse of Darwinism. This is before natural selection returns with a vengeance in what's often referred to as the modern synthesis of the 1930s and 40s. This is when Darwin's evolution was dramatically vindicated by new discoveries in genetics. At any rate, Simpson, working in the eclipse era, has an entirely different way of working with the science compared with his predecessors. After Simpson's death in 1934, the chair becomes extinct. But that isn't the end of the story, because I want to finish actually by looking at another principal, Ruth Page, who made a really original response to evolutionary and environmental science with her 1996 book, God and the Web of Creation. Now, before I go into these figures in more depth, notice that the existence of the Free Church as an independent institution is bookended by new phases in evolutionary thinking. So there's Vestiges at the beginning in 1844, and the modern synthesis, which ended the eclipse era around the 1830s. Is this significant? Well, I doubt it, but it surely isn't coincidental that the chair in natural science was first created at a time of major controversy around evolution. A bit of background first. So evolution wasn't a new idea in the 1840s. For one thing, the French naturalist Lamarck had proposed a theory of organic progression in the early 1800s, and in this there's a hierarchy of increased complexity of organisms which develops over time. And this is very different to Darwin's later theory of natural selection, because it doesn't rely on common descent, but it is still naturalistic all the same. In any case, Lamarckism wasn't supported well in Britain because influential scientists like Adam Sedgwick and William Buckland rejected it on the grounds that it constituted unbelief and rank materialism. Instead, these people were committed to special creation, where each species appeared fully formed in the fossil record, not having developed but having been designed as such by God. In this, they believed that they were following the evidence of the fossil record as scientists. The lack of transitionary forms between species, for instance, was thought to count heavily against evolution. Well, into this setting, Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation was published anonymously in 1844. It was lapped up by the British public, but lamented by scientists like Sedgwick and Buckland on the other. It created a sensation. It made the comparison with Newton's law of gravitation, which controlled all of inorganic matter. So Vestiges proposed there was a similarly grand principle in the organic world, and it was called the principle of development, or what we would call evolution now. And together, these principles of gravitation and development could explain the growth of the universe, stars, planets, and the progress of life towards increasing complexity, and of course, towards humankind at the pinnacle. And this scheme was set in a rich matrix of natural theology, with many references to the work of the divine author. But it was obviously naturalistic at heart, and it crucially resembled Lamarck's view of evolution. So for many scientific critics, Vestiges was really a bit too far beyond the pale. It played fast and loose with the science and was a little bit too Lamarckian. But there were also religious concerns around its overt naturalism. And in the newly born Free Church, it certainly created anxiety. So a very caustic assessment of Vestiges appeared in the Church's North British Review, warning of the materialism and the godless fatalism taught by the book. In the meantime, John Fleming, who had been a parish minister before moving to Aberdeen as the chair in natural philosophy, he was quietly engineering an appointment for himself at New College. Fleming, who had joined the Free Church at the disruption, realised that his position at Aberdeen was becoming really quite precarious. And it's worth noting that Fleming's scientific credentials were absolutely impeccable. He was certainly one of the foremost British zoologists of his day. But so deep was the division caused by the disruption that he really was in danger of losing his job. Anyway, Fleming wrote to Chalmers in August 1843, suggesting that if this new college in Edinburgh, which people were talking about, was to come off, then it would need someone to teach natural history or natural theology. Such a course, explained Fleming, would empower parish ministers and missionaries. They would be able to talk with farmers, miners, and fishermen, as well as to proclaim the works of God with authority from the pulpit. Well, Chalmers was persuaded, and he went about establishing a suitable chair for Fleming at New College. By the time the chair came up for approval before the Free Church's General Assembly in 1845, the Vestiges controversy was well underway, and that provides the perfect illustration for why such expertise as Fleming's was needed. So the Assembly voted unanimously to establish the chair of natural science and to appoint Fleming to it straight away. He was invited to address the Assembly, and he congratulated the Free Church for making such a progressive move in favour of science, unlike the Church of England. And especially he congratulated the Free Church in light of the gross materialism which was becoming fashionable, because he planned to combat this. Well, Fleming clearly had Vestiges in mind, and he mentioned it. He made the point that, of course, he hadn't read it, but from what he'd seen, it clearly came from someone who was unacquainted with the science. Fleming therefore promised that his new students would be acquainted with the science, all the better for their preaching, their conversation with parishioners, and of course, their prayers to their Maker. And so Fleming begins his new work at New College, age 60, which is to be the last phase of his life. He seems to publish relatively little during this time, at least compared with his prodigious scientific output when he was a parish minister, such as his Philosophy of Zoology of 1822, or his Encyclopedic History of British Animals in 1828, and a very famous paper in 1826, which was probably the most influential of all, because it poured scorn on those who interpreted the Earth's geology in terms of Noah's flood. What we do have from this last phase of his work is his posthumous book, The Lithology of Edinburgh, the rocks of Edinburgh, in other words, and several accounts of his course in natural science that he taught at New College. True to his word, his course is an overview of what was then the state of the art in mineralogy, chemistry, biology, and geology. And as you might expect, Vestiges comes in for special attack, along with other evolutionary works, which Fleming regards as, and I quote, crude generalizations from imperfect or misunderstood data, fostering errors of a very dangerous kind, visionary and loathsome materialism. End of quote. Today we might regard this as a sign of Fleming's personal theological agenda, but in his day it's clear that Fleming thinks he's speaking as a scientist from the material evidence. Throughout, he has a clear preference to present the science as science, letting it speak for itself, without introducing unnecessary theological or philosophical glosses. In the few occasions when he does introduce theological glosses, he assumes that the science should point to the divine purpose which God has placed in nature, evidence that it was deliberately designed and didn't evolve naturalistically. And in all this, Fleming is typical of many British scientists of his time, so steeped in natural theology that he can't tell it apart from the science, or so we might conclude today. All that is to change with Darwin's Origin of Species, published just 2 years after Fleming's death. Well, by the time Fleming died, vestiges had been out for 13 years, and evolution was no longer the fresh challenge it had been at the foundation of New College. So questions arose as to whether Fleming should be replaced in the chair, or whether it was time to abandon the teaching of science. In the face of no clear agreement other than that Fleming had done a good job, a compromise was reached to replace Fleming by a lecturer in natural science on a year-by-year basis. Several incumbents went by in quick succession, and eventually the General Assembly agreed to increase the tenure to 3 years, and they appointed Dr. John Duns, Minister of Torficum. And he seems to have acquitted himself pretty well, because in 1869, funds become available to endow the chair, and Duns is promoted to the chair in natural science. But Duns is a very different kind of character from Fleming. He does have a solid background in biology, but he doesn't contribute to the science as a leading researcher in the way that Fleming had. Also, interestingly, Duns is concerned to distinguish natural science from theology, and it makes Duns sound significantly more modern than Fleming. So we now need to speak of a relationship between science and theology, a relationship that wasn't clearly there in Fleming. Sometimes he might speak of harmony, Duns, sometimes of conflict, but not of identity. Another characteristic move that Duns makes is to introduce the militaristic metaphors that are so typical of later talk about conflict between science and religion. So, for instance, Duns tells his trainee ministers they must understand science to fight the false friends of the church who have already grasped the weapons of science. Why this sharpening of categories and language from Fleming just a few years earlier? Well, the answer is that by now the Darwin debates are in full swing. I'll assume that you're broadly familiar with Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, but I'll make the distinction with Lamarck's earlier system, which had influenced vestiges. In Lamarck, evolution is effectively a ladder of progress towards increased complexity with time. So individual species do evolve, but there's an overall teleology, an end in sight, organisation built into the wider scheme of life beyond the fate of an individual species as it struggles to survive. This means that, although Lamarck is a naturalistic theory of evolution, it's much easier to do natural theology with than with Darwin. It's much easier to interpret Lamarck's scheme in terms of a divine purpose. Darwin, on the other hand, has no ladder of progress, no grand principle or overall sense of teleology. So if Fleming had seen vestiges as a threat to his view of special creation, then you can imagine that Duns saw Darwin as a far greater threat. And sure enough, Duns doesn't hold back. Just 6 months after the publication of Origin of Species in 1859, and several years before he becomes fully established at New College, Duns publishes one of the earliest and most scathing reviews of Origin of Species, criticising Darwin on both scientific and theological grounds. Here's how the review begins. If notoriety be any proof of successful authorship, Mr. Darwin has had his reward. Duns goes on to point out that scientifically, the evidence speaks fully against Darwin. Not only are there no transitional forms between species in the fossil record, but the evidence points to permanent forms designed by the Creator. It's very clear, he thinks, that God keeps species persistently distinct from each other. The Creator has a clear plan for life in creation, a grand scheme. Now, in this, Duns does appear to be veering a bit towards vestiges, which Fleming had railed against, of course. And in fact, he clearly prefers vestiges over Origin of Species. This is what he says. we believe there is good reason for affirming that everything which is false as to the scheme of life in the worthless development theory is contained in the origin of species, and a great deal in addition which is more mischievous and profane than anything to be met with in the vestiges. Were it possible that the terrible alternative could ever be receive either the vestiges or the origin of species, we would without hesitation choose the former. Both are burlesques on true science, but the vestiges contains views less dishonouring to the Creator and less antagonistic to common sense than those met with in the origin of species, and this is affirming much. However low the views of God in the former, there is more respect shown for those great laws of life, which are manifestations of his will and whose constant regularity we would no sooner question than we would our own existence. But in the latter, there is nothing of this. End of quotation. Vestiges might be bad, suggests Duns, but origin is just awful. Well, this highly negative view of Darwin characterises much of Duns's later writing, and right to the end of his career at New College, Duns continues to attack evolution in general and Darwinism in particular. And in its place, Duns promotes an undiluted version of special creation and design, arguing from the fossil evidence. For example, he asks in the 1870s, why do the Carboniferous rocks, of which there are many around Edinburgh, why do the Carboniferous rocks show abundant evidence of land plants, but not herbivorous land animals to eat them? There's little sign of land animals at all in the Carboniferous. Surely, evolutionary theory would require that where there's food, there will be animals adapted to eat it. But Duns has what he calls a magnificent argument in natural theology at the ready. This is it. These plants in the Carboniferous lived and died so that coal would be laid down in the coal measures, ready for humans born millions of years later. The design argument succeeds where Darwin fails. Now, it's fair to say that Duns is out on a limb. The Darwin debates are notoriously vociferous on both scientific and theological grounds, but within a decade or two, most biologists and geologists had come around to evolution in general terms, even if Darwin's particular version of it continued to provoke controversy. And there were influential theological voices in Edinburgh, including in the Free Church, who were willing to make peace with evolution. And ironically, one of the more prominent was the principal of New College during Duns's time, Robert Rainey, or Dr. Misty, as he was popularly known, owing to his readiness to concede contemporary developments rather than defend the church against them. In his inaugural address for the 1874-75 session at New College, which he called Evolution and Theology, Rainey pours oil on troubled water. We live in a time of increased scepticism of the Christian faith, he begins, and the relationship between science and religion is entangled in all discussions of the legitimacy of the Christian revelation. The biggest question of all concerns evolution, because it's usually assumed that this puts the Creator out of the picture, no longer active in creation. But, points out Rainey, this isn't actually much of a problem for theology, because the same question arises when we think about the beginnings of Christianity in the 1st and 2nd centuries. Is its origin divine or mundane? Well, he says, the Church dealt with this question long ago, and so we can adopt the same answer for evolution. Think of it this way. Suppose evolutionary theory became so successful that it explained every detail of life, even its very beginnings. The believer wouldn't be deterred, thinks Rainey, but would simply realise that the point of divine origination should be pushed further back in time. Faith isn't built on any quantum of divine interference, he points out, so much as the persuasion of divine glory, revelation in other words. He then goes on to address the issue of human origins, which, as I'm sure you're aware, is a notorious sticking point ever since the publication of Origin of Species. Well, Rainey reassures his listeners they've got nothing to worry about here either. It's the question of divine origination again. And if we move it into the spiritual domain, then science can't touch it. Humans possess, and he says, the incommunicable quality which, as a celestial spark, burns in the race. In other words, what he's saying is that humans are the spiritual animals. That's what sets us apart as made in the image of God. Now, I can't help thinking that Rainey just simply redefines the problem here so that science can't get at it. But to be fair, this is how much theological thinking even today continues to reassert human uniqueness in the face of challenges from evolution. At any rate, it seems to do the trick then, because according to the reports in The Scotsman, Rainey's lecture is peppered with enthusiastic applauses and shouts of "hear, hear," and he seems to answer a widely felt need in 1870s Edinburgh to make peace with evolution. He might echo the same militaristic language of conflict between faith and science as that used by Duns, but Rainey's tactic is one of rapprochement, not militancy. Duns, though, still occupying the chair in natural science, feels no such need to make peace. I do wonder what the atmosphere was like in the common room, and he continues to wage war on evolution for nearly another 30 years until his retirement in 1903. At that point, again, the question of whether the chair should be discontinued returns. And again, the arguments in the free churches, committees and assemblies are finely balanced, just as before. There's a decisive difference, though, which is that the chair has now been endowed, so the balance tips in favour of appointing again, with the proviso that the new professor should also cover science teaching in the Glasgow College as well as New College. And so James Young Simpson, freshly ordained after training at New College and the beginnings of an academic career in biology, is duly appointed, and he spends 30 years shuttling back and forth between New College and Glasgow before his death in 1934 spells the extinction of the chair. Now, Simpson is entirely unlike Duns. He doesn't question the legitimacy of evolutionary science, as Duns had, and neither does he argue over the evidence, as Duns had. Simpson does something completely different. He takes evolution as a given, and he uses it as a springboard to develop his own mystical view of science, cosmology, and human origins. Now, Simpson isn't unique here. His predecessor at Glasgow, Henry Drummond, did much the same in his bestseller of 1883, Natural Law in the Spiritual World. And the title says it all, really. Drummond turned evolution, the biological laws of nature, into a source of moral and theological laws. This is a spirituality of evolution, if you like, a new kind of natural theology. No longer concerned to provide evidence of God's existence through design, Drummond now uses nature as the entire framework for interpreting theological convictions. And here's his famous thesis statement. The position we have been led to take up is not that the spiritual laws are analogous to the natural laws, but that they are the same laws. It is not a question of analogy, but of identity. End of quotation. This is a completely new approach to the problem of science and religion. Instead of fighting each other as Duns and Rainey had it before, science and religion now need to merge into a single entity. Of course, Fleming had them merged long before this, but largely because his pre-Darwin categories were insufficiently advanced to do much else. But now, post-Darwin, a deliberate hermeneutical strategy is called for by Drummond, and in common with others who've taken a similar approach to uniting science and religion since, such as Teilhard de Chardin, Drummond needs to drum up a significant degree of imaginative, visionary and literary skill to make it work. Now, Simpson, who's a great admirer of Drummond, says of Drummond that he was not so much a biologist invading the world of religion as a poet invading and capturing the world of science. A poet, and that is definitely the sense you get reading Drummond. Simpson follows in much the same path himself. He doesn't have the same rhetorical flourish as Drummond, not much of a poet, but his writing certainly provides some amazingly purple patches where he attempts to integrate evolution and theology into a similarly mystical vision of nature. Well, happily for Simpson, he doesn't suffer from the accusations of heresy which Drummond had faced. By Simpson's day, the outrage has worn off, and there's now a number of other clergy and theologians exploring this new evolutionary natural theology. Now, scientifically, you can think of Simpson as operating in the phase that I referred to as the eclipse of Darwinism in the early 20th century, when evolutionary science was becoming increasingly diverse but wasn't united behind a central body of theory. Quite simply, Darwin has gone out of fashion for a time and won't return until around the 1930s, when his theory of natural selection is decisively reinforced by new advances in genetics. But in the meantime, proponents of what is now being called the new natural theology, like Simpson, these people are free to exploit the teleological accounts of evolution which flourished in this time, much more typical of Lamarck than Darwin. So Simpson's first major theological work, for instance, called The Spiritual Interpretation of Nature in 1912, this is absolutely saturated with a progressive view of evolution as God's preferred method of creation. And in common with others of the time, Simpson believes that the emergence of mind is a central driving force in evolution, inevitably leading to human self-consciousness. The evolution of mind gives Simpson a way to naturalize the spiritual dimension of humans, or to transcendentalize the material. And at one point, he calls upon the duality of mass and energy, this is E equals mc squared. He suggests that extraordinarily powerful minds, like those of Jesus, might be able to control matter and energy to work miracles. What's more, Simpson thinks, the evolution of mind in the universe must point to the continued existence of our minds after death. Human immortality must be a consequence of the evolutionary process, he thinks, because otherwise God's constitution of Homo sapiens as the spiritual animal would render the labouring of the universe towards humans completely pointless. So immortality must be out there. Well, he goes on to develop much of this in even more visionary forms in later books, particularly his most mature work called The Garment of the Living God, which was published after his death in 1934. And he sees evolutionary science as making crucial junctions with theology. So he points out that earlier in history, science had to conform to religious thought. And then, in the scientific revolution, the tables were turned as science advanced rapidly, leaving theology to fall behind. But now, he says, we are on the threshold of a new natural theology where science teaches us of the manifestation of an infinite mind energy. This is a key term of his, the infinite mind energy, but I have to admit that it's pretty tricky to interpret. At times I think he seems to be talking about the progressive force behind evolution, driving the material universe towards the revelation of mind. At others it seems almost godlike in its creative omnipotence, almost as though Simpson is just a hair's breadth from pantheism. At any rate, he connects the infinite mind energy with another key word of his, freedom, which is also one of his terms for evolution. He says, where life is, there is a measure of freedom. Even the single-celled forms of life practice the method of trial and error and learn in their small way by experience. Evolution may be interpreted as the winning of freedom. End of quotation. So freedom is important for Simpson because evolution allows all organisms to experience it. That's what evolution is about. And for humans, the spiritual animals, it's what allows us to achieve union with Christ, he explains, which is the last stage of evolution. Well, I'm just giving you a taste here. There is much, much more to Simpson, but I want to take his term freedom and carry it over to my final thinker, Ruth Page. But before I get to her, I just need to describe the extinction of the chair. Well, in Simpson's last years, it becomes clear that the chair in natural science will be phased out when he retires. The churches had reunited in 1929, and negotiations are underway to merge New College with the University of Edinburgh, and that comes to pass in 1935. So there would be plentiful resources available without the need of a chair in natural science at New College. Well, Simpson complains publicly in The Scotsman that the church needs to look outward rather than continue to invest heavily in its semi-medieval curriculum. But when Simpson dies suddenly in 1934, the decision is taken to axe the chair completely, on the grounds that science really does belong in another faculty. And so the church and New College opt decisively to cut out science from theology after 89 years of integrating them. A sad year, in my opinion. Well, after the chair becomes extinct, it's decades before anyone else at New College commits their thoughts on natural selection to paper. Now, you might think that T.F. Torrance, our most illustrious theologian of the 20th century, and known especially for his deep interest in the natural sciences, well, you might think that he would have some interesting things to say on this. No. Torrance's silence on evolution is absolutely deafening. Instead, the next assessment of evolution after the chair becomes extinct, and it's a very significant assessment, I think, comes from Ruth Page, our one-time principal, in her book of 1996, God and the Web of Creation. But this means that the gap in the fossil record between Simpson in 1934 and Page in 1996, this is more than 60 years, this is huge in the history of evolutionary science, which means we have no missing link to explain how Simpson's ethereal mysticism evolves into Page's down-to-earth environmentalism. All we can say is that, just as with the three holders of the chair in natural science, Page's theology is shaped strongly by the scientific concerns of her day. And now, these are the same concerns of all of us, namely the pressing environmental crisis. Like Simpson before her, Page takes evolutionary biology as read, and she thinks that she needs to make radical claims about the nature of God from it, just as Simpson had. Unlike Simpson, though, Page isn't at all interested in mystical rhetoric. In fact, Page is notable for her scathing attacks on calls for design in nature and on attempts to carve out human uniqueness in the evolutionary edifice. Page's Darwinism is strikingly Darwinian for the very first time in New College history. Her point is that Christian doctrines of creation are all too often based on metaphysical speculation from Genesis, reinforced with some idealized view of nature where all is harmony. But there never was a golden age in nature, she points out. We need to engage with the science of the here and now and with the urgent environmental crisis of the here and now, and take these as our starting points. On her way, she dismisses the conventional questions that have been raised and still are today in the science and theology field about how does God act in the world, questions of which have been dominant since the time of Newton. Instead, she thinks, natural selection should make us realise that God's relationship with the world is entirely different from that of a force or a cause. There's no divine push, she says, whether of atoms or organisms. God doesn't cause things to happen. God doesn't even create new species through evolution. Instead, God creates possibilities for creatures to explore and evolve into. The evolutionary process is fundamentally, from God's perspective, about creating freedom. Of course, Simpson had used exactly the same term when he defined evolution. It isn't clear that Page is aware of this, but nevertheless she makes great use of this term freedom. She says there's no teleology in nature implanted from the outside, no divine push, no divine force directing the unfolding of life. There's only the freedom of every creature to explore and to experience the love of God in their own domain and in their own way. This means that although Page's God may not act directly in the world as a divine push, God is no less immediate for that, once we've replaced our Newtonian fixation with Darwin, and that allows her to explore the ecological crisis using another feature of the evolutionary landscape which is popular in theology, namely the idea that all creatures are strongly interconnected. There's a web of creation. Well, Page's book was published in 1996, and it still strikes me as fresh and innovative, especially since much of the discussion of evolution in the science and theology world since continues to make use of rather outmoded categories which she rejects. Divine action continues to be largely Newtonian, cause and effect, like so many billiard balls, and evolution continues to be a bit more Lamarck than Darwin, a bit too top-heavy with teleology. Page's Darwinism is still just a bit too Darwinian for much of the modern science and theology field. I hope that her day is still to come. But to move towards an ending, I've presented you with well over 150 years of New College thought on evolution. It's easy to demonstrate that every stage shows the signs of its times in scientific terms, and yet every thinker here can also be connected up with an existing school of thought in the science and theology conversation. And that shows a very interesting distinction or difference between theology and science. Theological thought on evolution doesn't evolve so much as diversify, very different from science. What are my own thoughts on this? Well, it would be churlish of me not to recognise the work of my current colleagues in New College today. Science and religion is flourishing in New College, and there are 4 members of staff who make it our primary area of teaching and research. And of course, we engage with evolutionary science on a near daily basis. But I would like to take the opportunity now, after having told you about the evolution of natural science at New College, to declare a sort of manifesto for myself. After all, it is the time for manifestos, isn't it? So if you look at my page on the School of Divinity's website, you'll see that I describe myself there, somewhat pretentiously, I guess, as a physicist working in a theological environment. Well, I don't say that in order to trumpet my scientific credentials, so much as to emphasise how I personally see my role in New College, continuing the work of my ancestors. Out of the figures that I've put before you, it's John Fleming with whom I feel most in common, although I must admit that I don't share his suspicion of evolution. Fleming wasn't particularly interested in apologetics like Duns and Rainey, and neither was he interested in synthesising science and theology like Simpson and Page. Instead, he wanted to present science as science and to let the questions flow from that. I'm often asked by others working in the science and theology field why I don't share their concern for apologetics, why I'm not interested in defending theology from science, nor even in trying to carve out a niche for theology in the scientific landscape. It's true, I have absolutely none of these concerns. Fundamentally, though, I believe that the doing of good science will always lead to good theology, and that's an empirical observation. But, like Fleming, I believe that the doing of science is a theological activity in itself. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mark, for a characteristically clear and engaging lecture. You've shown true erudition in a broad array of topics, from the existence of God, E=mc², to the giddy heights of staffing decisions at New College. And it's good to hear that we've always been at the forefront of the science and religion debate, or should I say integration, an area I look forward to seeing you move forward in over the next few years. So Mark has indicated that he's willing to take questions. We don't always have questions at inaugurals, but this is your chance. If you would like to ask Mark anything, we've got a few more minutes.
Well, first of all, very warm thanks. Margaret Mackay is my name, and I'm a former director of the School of Scottish Studies at the University of Edinburgh here. And I've had an interest in Simpson for some time, since I discovered that he was a founder member of the Scottish Anthropological and Folklore Society in the 1930s. I think 1932 is the date at which it emerged. This, in some ways, might have been a precursor of my department, which didn't come into being, in fact, until after the Second World War, 1950-51. We're about to celebrate our 70th anniversary. But it has interested me to see that he played a role in it, as he did in the Royal Anthropological Institute, which had an Edinburgh Lothians branch for 10 years before, from 1922. He was also, I discover, a member of the commission that selected or decided upon the boundaries of the Baltic states after the end of World War I. But I wonder if you might wish to comment just on the nature of his personality in regard to these developing subjects within a Scottish university context.
Thank you. Yes, thanks for pointing out that Simpson is a truly incredible person, as most of these people were. I've just spoken about their interests in evolution, but Simpson clearly has a lot of other things going on. If you look at his Wikipedia page, for instance, it talks about his renown as a diplomat, which you alluded to there. He was fluent in Russian, made quite a number of trips to Russia, and wrote quite a few books on it, including a book on vodka. So he was definitely a polymath as well as his interests in biology. His biography is fascinating because it describes all of this in great depth and indicates how much of this he was influenced by Henry Drummond that I mentioned, another fascinating character who was willing to think in all kinds of different dimensions. And I really only started getting interested in Simpson a month or two ago, and I'm only about halfway through his work. So I think when I write the book, I will certainly have a lot more to say on Simpson, I think. But he's a very impressive character.
Mark, thanks for a wonderful lecture. I have a frivolous question and a serious question. The frivolous question is for you and the head of college. What happened to the endowment when the chair went and became part of Edinburgh University? Is there a gold mine sitting in a bank account somewhere? That was the frivolous question. You don't have to answer that. The serious question is, I noticed that Simpson became that he held that chair from 1904, you said? Yes? Is that right?
Yes.
So that's just 4 years before Edinburgh founded its first chair in psychology in 1908. And given that you talk a lot about mind, I wonder whether there are any dimensions there and hidden currents. Did he interact with the new chair in psychology in Edinburgh, just down the road in George Square?
As far as I know, not, but that doesn't mean that he didn't interact with university academics. For one thing, he taught in the zoology faculty for a couple of years as well, so there certainly were links between New College and the university at that time. But I'm not aware of any conversations he had with psychology at the time, or psychologists. I can answer your frivolous question. It's mentioned in the New College history about the endowment. Very, very quietly, though, it was decided to do something else with the money. And I forget quite what that was, but it clearly wasn't to further a chair anyway.
Thanks, Professor Harris. Really excellent. I have a question about, this is also a period in the late 19th century where idealism is becoming a big factor in Scotland. And I'm curious, in particular with Simpson, but among others, with Drummond as well, is there any contact with Andrew Seth Pringle Pattison, who's a proponent of kind of a personal idealism as a critique of Hegel as it kind of comes into Scotland and whatnot. I'm curious as to whether there's a connection between more of the philosophy going on in Edinburgh with these kinds of advances in how science gets dealt with at New College and later on.
Yeah, thanks. I'm absolutely sure that there must have been influence there, but neither Simpson nor Drummond cites these people as far as I can tell. But yes, you can see the heavy influence of idealistic philosophy in the way they really parade the evolution of mind as being this is the whole point of the universe.
Thank you, Mark. I really appreciated that lecture. And I want to ask you about your final comments, your manifesto comments. So I entirely agree that good science leads to good theology, and you're a scientist working in a theology department. But as you know, I'm married to a theologian who works in a science department at the moment. And so I'm wondering if you also think the reverse, that good theology can lead to better science, not just better science to good theology.
That's a great question. Clearly it has in the past. For much of the time that we might refer to as the scientific revolution and before, there was a huge amount of crosstalk between science and theology. In fact, it's even meaningless really to use those categories in that period. It's really only, as I hope I made clear, from about the time of Darwin that they start to separate. You start to see clear blue water between them. I think someone like me would always hope that theology would influence science to some degree, and I know plenty of scientists like me who are fascinated by theology. Whether it actually influences their day-to-day thinking, possibly not in any clear way, but I would certainly hope for more friendliness between the two areas. But I think, so while science certainly has influence on theology, insofar as theology is a kind of commenting and interpreting discipline, it's not quite clear to me that the reverse is true, but there nevertheless is some kind of hidden influence.
Thank you very much, Mark. I suppose one way that the history that you presented could be read is a progressive squeezing of the concept of teleological explanations out of science. Now, if teleological explanations have been squeezed out of science, and if it's also the case that our understanding of God must at some point involve reference to concepts like purpose and teleology, how is that chasm to be crossed?
That's a great question, Charles, and I would love to know your thoughts on that, since I know you're writing a PhD thesis on this exact topic. For myself, this is clearly yeah, so no, you're absolutely right that ever since the mid-19th century, teleology has vanished or slowly evaporated from science, but theology has had a hard time accepting that and keeps trying to put it back in again when it engages with science, which is why it's so wonderful to read someone like Ruth Page, who tries her hardest to work with the science as science and actually find some positive ways forward, largely by being very creative with her categories, I must say, and trying to experiment with theology. One of the things I do like about her and others who have tried to engage with the absence of teleology in science is the kind of thought experiment that context that you can use in theology to sort of float an idea, really. And so I don't have a clear idea there. I don't have a clear picture on what do we do with the evaporation of teleology, but I think we, as theologians, need to keep trying out new thought experiments here.
Well, it's my very happy duty to invite you all to a celebratory glass of Prosecco. You might have heard some clinking in the background there. But before we adjourn to the back half of the hall, can we thank Mark once again for a wonderful lecture and for showing very much that he is not an extinct professor.